Steph.
Leah,
Jess?
is this line secure?
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Secure Line. I'm Stephanie Carvin. The Middle East has seen a year of heartbreak and dramatic developments. Ceasefires and missile strikes traded places almost weekly. The United States launched direct attacks on Iranian nuclear sites. Israel's operation in Gaza and the West Bank, which caused global outrage, have stopped, at least temporarily, with the precarious peace agreement. Across the region, economic strain, humanitarian crises, and great power rivalries seem to once again be redefining regional and international politics. So, what does this all mean? To help us answer this question, friend of the pod, Thomas Juneau, unpacks how a year of turmoil in the Middle East is reshaping regional and global affairs and impacting Canada's foreign policy. Thomas, thanks for joining the podcast again. I think you are officially our first repeat guest. And of course, Leah and Jess are here too. Great to have you. So let's just dive right in. So much has happened in the Middle East, and we'd like to do like kind of a tour de table of some of the many issues going on today. And I went back and actually listened to that first episode you were on with Justin Ling, and we discussed Trump's intentions for the Middle East, and we noticed some striking contradictions. Trump said he wanted to end a lot of the wars that were happening, and we agreed that he was perhaps the only person who could put pressure on Netanyahu, but that he was also being pressured by Iran hawks within the GOP to whack Iran. That was the term I think that was used at the time, and go after the Houthis. And we seem to have had a bit of both. There is this peace deal in Gaza, although it's very unstable. And he did, quote unquote, whack Iran in June when he hit the Fordow nuclear site. So have we learned anything about Trump's approach to the Middle East? And is there any way to know what to expect for what's coming?
I don't think there's really a way to know what to expect. And keeping in mind that even presidents before Trump, we sometimes exaggerated the consistency or the patterns or the worldview that they would apply to their Middle East foreign policies. In the case of Trump, no, there's no consistent doctrine in by any reasonable definition of the term. So on some days, Trump is more on the isolationist side. He wants to disengage, downsize the American presence in the region. On other days, he's hawkish and interventionist. Look at, for example, the 2-month campaign to strike the Houthis in the spring, right? That was not isolationist in any way. And he'll just swing from one side to the other, whether it's on Israel, it's on Iran, on Yemen, or on other parts. On some conflicts, he will openly want to disengage and say he's not interested. In others, Israel-Palestine being at the top of the list, he has now committed the U.S. to a sustained effort to manage that dispute. How active is he going to be is a mystery at this point. But I think the bottom line is that Trump is extraordinarily unpredictable in general, but specifically on the Middle East. And his actions are not consistently following any kind of set of guidelines. But again, keeping in mind that you could say the same thing about a number of his predecessors. I mean, think about Obama, right? I mean, on some issues, Obama was quite hawkish. Think about drone strikes against al-Qaeda in Yemen or in Somalia that were pretty intense. But on others, Obama was talking about disengaging. Think about his refusal to commit a serious military effort to Syria. And then you had a number of swings in between. So not to say that Trump and Obama are the same, but that pattern of inconsistency is kind of the norm in many ways.
Is there any through line to his approach to the Middle East, do you think? Can you find any, singular motivating force that seems to define his decision making, or is it really the whims of who's the last person to talk to him?
Well, I think if there's one pattern is his consistent desire to put himself at the center of the attention. Think about Gaza. His name is on the plan, right? The 20-point plan that led to the ceasefire in Gaza. It's the Trump peace plan. Yes, presidents in the past have been very personally involved, but the ceasefire that happened a few weeks ago in Gaza is the result of his direct intervention. And as much as I'm critical of Trump on pretty much anything else, the ceasefire in Gaza would not have happened without him. It simply would not have, because he put significant pressure on Netanyahu, which Biden was not able or willing to do before. And he also, and I don't like saying this, but he doesn't get enough credit for that. He coordinated, and we don't say that often, but he worked hard, and his administration worked hard to coordinate with Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. to put pressure on Hamas. And he coordinated with a number of other Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, to create the context that led to, at the very least, that ceasefire to happen. But the whole point, to answer your question specifically, is that it's him. It's extremely personalized. There are good aspects to that in the sense that as long as he continues to be involved, there is a chance, far from a certainty, but a chance of further progress. But the massive downside is that if he becomes distracted, as we know that his attention span is extremely short, et cetera, if his attention span goes elsewhere, then whatever limited progress that we've seen so far could collapse very fast.
So speaking of Gaza, Canada's had to walk something of a tight rope on this issue, but along with other states like the UK, France, and Australia, Canada said it would recognize Palestine as a state, albeit with a lot of caveats. Can you walk us through this and what it means, and why now, and why did it take so long, and what will the actual outcome of this be?
So that's a good question. I think there's a lot to say about that. The first point that I'd say is that it is not a significant change in Canadian policy. And I think both critics and supporters of this decision have exaggerated its importance. Supporters in saying this is a historical move by Canada that rights a historical wrong. It doesn't right a historical wrong. There is still no Palestinian state. And critics have portrayed this as a major shift in Canadian foreign policy in a critical way, which it is not. What are the pillars of Canada's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that have more or less stayed constant for decades? We support a two-state solution. We are close to Israel, much closer to Israel than to the Palestinian side. We support the Palestinian Authority, but our relation with them is lukewarm. We support reform of the Palestinian Authority, and we actually do it. We don't just say it. For example, we are an important provider of training to Palestinian security forces. We oppose Hamas. Hamas is listed as a terrorist entity, as it should be, and we have taken a clear line on Hamas forever. These pillars have not changed. What has changed is the situation on the ground. And I think the position has kind of adapted to that. So by recognizing a Palestinian state, first of all, on the ground, it doesn't change anything. There is no Palestinian state on the morning after Canada, France, the UK, and a number of others have done that. 140-something states had already done it. There will be a Palestinian state when there is a negotiation with Israel. It is consistent with the main pillars of our policy that I mentioned. Is it purely rhetorical and symbolic, meant to appease a certain domestic constituency, as critics of the decision have said? I don't think so. I don't think that it has been a major political winner or loser in any case for the government. To me, the value of doing that is a limited value. It's not a game changer in any way. But if a number of countries, Canada, Europeans, Australia, recognize a Palestinian state and act in consequence, i.e., boost the Palestinian Authority, it does, to my mind, slightly improve the chances of a successful peace process in the future. And to be clear, I'm not optimistic. I'm not naive. There are massive obstacles before a peace process comes. But one of the many conditions for a peace process to eventually succeed is a strong Palestinian Authority to negotiate with Israel, but also to act as a counterweight to Hamas. How does a strong Palestinian Authority happen? With support from the international community. And to me, that's where, as a small step, those recognitions can have a positive role.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on this because, even in my friend group who doesn't work in the international affairs space, like their immediate thought about the recognition was that it was for a domestic audience rather than for the international community. And I don't think that that's true. I think it was very much, right, we saw a consistent shift from abstaining to voting against Israel in UN General Assembly votes across the conflict to, this now more obvious break in alignment with Israel, right? To say, no, we do not stand with you, Israel, on what's happening in Gaza. And so it's really a diplomatic shift of Canadian position designed to signal within the international community a dislocation with Israel on this, a breaking away, not that we're not allies, but that we are breaking away from them where we were firmly rooted on Israel's side in all UN General Assembly resolutions on this for years and years. So this really is about like the diplomatic song and dance rather than doing something for Canadian audiences to appease those who are obviously aghast at what's taking place in Gaza right now.
I mean, I think that's also an important point to make. First of all, It is absolutely understandable and justified for people to be cynical that Canadian foreign policy could be driven by domestic political purposes or calculations, including diaspora politics. That was a major criticism that I certainly made and that a number of other people made about the Trudeau government. And I think that's conditioned a lot of people when they see foreign policy, but that's driven by domestic considerations, because under Trudeau, it was so often true. Not to say that it wasn't true under Harper. I think it often was as well, but that's the last 10 years, right? So that cynicism is understandable and generally speaking justified. I think another diplomatic aspect that I would mention, in addition to the signal that it sends to Israel, I wouldn't use the word dislocation because by and large, we remain very close to Israel. All the pillars of our proximity to Israel have not changed beyond that one. Not to diminish that one, but everything else continues. I would also add the diplomatic signal to the Europeans. In a world of Trumpism, in a world of the efforts by the current Carney government to diversify not only our trade partnerships, but also our security partnerships, this was done in close coordination with Europeans. And to me, going beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is an important point, right? Canada will need to work more closely with Europeans on major international issues in the future, and this was a good test case of that.
Yeah, I agree with you. Not a dislocation, more of a sprain, right? So still attached, but there's some tearing.
Absolutely, there is some tension in it. If you just look at the reaction by the Israeli embassy here in Ottawa, by the Israeli government, you could see that it was not a happy one.
So moving on to Iran, that's a country that's had a very punishing few years. It has lost many of its best Hezbollah fighters in Syria and then Lebanon. It took that hit from Trump earlier this year when it hit Fordow. And at the same time, though, it does seem to have deepened its alliance with Russia, giving it a lifeline. So how should we understand Iran's position in the Middle East right now, or even globally? And what might we expect from it in the next year?
And this is something that I've looked at a fair bit, and I published an article earlier this year for one of the Middle East Studies journals on exactly this issue.
We can make sure to link to that in the show notes.
Iran has had a really bad 2 years, and I think that's the bottom line. When October 2023 came with the Hamas attack on Israel, it was not clear where this would go for Iran. This was a military humiliation for Israel, an intelligence failure, perhaps, certainly a political failure for Israel. So where this would go for Iran, I think, was not clear. But what we saw, especially starting in the spring and summer of 2024, and it's only intensified since, is a series of geopolitical blows for Iran. And when you add them all up, it's a catastrophe. This has been probably since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, maybe even since the revolution in 79, the most difficult 2 years geopolitically for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Its only state ally in the region, the Assad regime in Syria, has disappeared. That has been a massive loss for Iran because a lot of Iran's actions in the Levant, its support for Hezbollah, in particular, were transiting through Syria. So that's a springboard that it has lost. And Iran now has no state ally in the Middle East. Hezbollah has not been defeated, but it has been seriously weakened by Israel in Lebanon. And Hezbollah now is really not the military power that it was just 2 years ago. Hamas has not been dismantled and eliminated by Israel, but it has also been seriously weakened. It is not the military threat that it used to be. Iran itself, in 2 confrontations in 2024 with Israel in April and October, and then even more so in June 2025, really took a beating. And if you look at what happened in those 3 confrontations, Iran inflicted minimal damage on Israel. Really minimal damage, very small number of victims, very small number of physical damage. Whereas Israel, especially in June 2025, seized not full, but significant control of Iranian airspace, targeted almost at will military sites, infrastructure, nuclear sites in Iran. And the key point is that Israel stopped. Israel, and I'm speaking strictly from a technical and military perspective, Israel could have continued to inflict major damage on Iran, whereas Iran could not do the reverse to Israel. So if you look at the balance of power in the Middle East, centered around the Iran-Israel fault line, it has significantly shifted in the last 18, 20, 22 months to Israel's advantage and to Iran's loss.
Did Iran want to have successful and major destructive effect from their attacks on Israel and failed to do so? Or were the attacks voluminous for show, but not escalatory?
That's a good point because, one of the pillars of the Islamic Republic's defense doctrine, especially since 2001, 2003, right, post-Afghanistan and Iraq, is that Iran always acutely understood that from a conventional military perspective, it is significantly weaker than Israel and the US. Iran had never illusions that it could be a peer competitor on conventional military grounds to its two rivals. That's why Iran really developed this doctrine of supporting non-state actors, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, groups in Syria, groups in Iraq, to keep confrontation at an indirect level. And when that was happening, Iran could actually achieve significant success. I always thought that there was a bit of a low ceiling to that success, but still, Iran could make the claim that it was pursuing and achieving influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, Yemen, the Gulf, and so on. What changed in 2024 is that Israel, in part because of the shock, the deep trauma in Israeli society of the 2023 October Hamas attack, Israel said, screw it. We are not going to respect this perception of a balance of terror between us and Iran, and we're going to hit them directly. And when Israel did that, for the first time, there was an open and direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. And that's where the massive conventional imbalance between the two sides really came out in a way that was not the case as long as it was in direct warfare. And you saw Iran take a severe beating. And now I think Iran always understood that. Iran always wanted to avoid that. It escalated in a way that it did not want. And now Iran's priority is to make sure that, to put it in simple terms, confrontation goes back to that gray zone or to that hybrid or indirect warfare, not the direct confrontation, because it knows it loses.
So in your previous discussions of Iran, you mentioned Syria a few times. We've seen dramatic shifts of what's taking place in Syria, largely fallen away from the news given everything else. But what is the state of play in Syria now? You've seen efforts by the leadership there to have sanctions removed. The new president has met with both President Trump, who called him a very handsome man, and Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that Putin was allied with Bashar al-Assad, as you mentioned. So what's the state of play now in Syria?
Syria is very fragile, and I think we need, by we I mean collectively, the international community need to pay more attention because yes, Assad fell within a matter of hours. If anything, it was a surprise. I mean, Syria analysts were surprised at how fast he fell. The new authority, led by Ahmed al-Sharaa, who used to lead more or less extremist-ish group, built this broader coalition, took control. But minorities in Syria, the Kurds in the northeast, the Druze in the south, remain very skeptical for good reason of his ability to lead the regime that will unify and reconcile an extraordinarily fractured Syria. And we have seen in the past few weeks a really worrying patterns of mounting fractures within Syria. In some cases fueled by Sunni militias, from the civil war era that have been committing atrocities against minorities. It's not only their fault, but that has been happening. Can you blame the new president for that? Probably, but it's also extremely hard, right? To expect him to fully control a country that was unimaginably devastated after 14 years and before that 40 something years of dictatorship. So I think the US, and again, I'm going to sound like I'm pro-Trump, which I'm not. Trump did the right thing, I think, to get the ceasefire in Gaza. Trump absolutely did the right thing in recognizing the new Syrian authorities, in meeting them, and in pushing to lift sanctions. Is that risky? It absolutely is. If the new president turns out to still be a Sunni extremist, then will that have been the wrong decision? Yes. But in the meantime, I think the US and accessorily Canada and Europeans need to give him a chance. They need to do everything they can to give him the tools to try to unify Syria and rebuild it after the war. And sanctions were a massive obstacle for that. So lifting sanctions was the right thing to do, at least for now.
And can you comment at all on this meeting with Vladimir Putin, which, let's be honest, Vladimir Putin pounded that country for a decade, just really, really horrific crimes. And so to see the leader of Syria standing there and kind of shaking his hand was a bit jarring. How should we think about this? Is this just kind of pure realpolitik, or is
Absolutely.
this something?
This is pragmatism at work. And, on the part of Russia, first of all, I mean, sometimes we look at Putin purely from our Western lens, where we see Putin, as a dogmatic, intransigent, ideological, anti-American, which might be true. But if you look at Putin in other parts of the world, he's very pragmatic. Not to say that he's nice, but he's very pragmatic, and he will be more than willing to let bygones be bygones. If you look at this from the Syrian president's perspective, he was himself, the group that he led, HTS in the north of Syria, was itself bombed by Russia multiple times, right? Because Russia, with Iran, through its intervention, is really what allowed Assad to survive for many years. But Ahmed al-Sharaa, the new president, has really understood that he needs Russia on his side, or at least that he needs Russia not to be antagonized to new Syrian authorities. So both sides have been very pragmatic in this. Yes, they still have very sore points from the past, and these have not been completely forgotten. But the new Syrian authorities have allowed Russia to keep its air base on the Syrian coast in the northwest. And they understand that is kind of a guarantee of a modus vivendi, even if it's not, warm friendship between the two sides. And I think that shows the pragmatism of that new Syrian government. Does it mean that it has completely purged itself of Sunni extremist ideological elements and physical elements from the past? Not clear, but probably not. But it does show that it is able of some level of pragmatism.
Can you just, for my own pure curiosity, what's Turkey's take on the new Syrian leader?
Turkey is the winner at this point. I mean, Turkey is the big winner of what's been going on in Syria, because Turkey has ambiguous relations with HTS, the group that overthrew Assad and now leads the new government. But it was cordial relations, right? I mean, but Turkey also supports a number of smaller groups, not HTS, that occupy a northern strip of Syria close to the Syrian border. So to say that HTS and Ahmed al-Sharaa is a pawn of Turkey is absolutely not true. It is far better for Turkey than Assad used to be, right? I mean, Turkey had come to terms with the fact that Assad had, for a while at least, won the war and had survived. So they were moving towards a level of equilibrium between them, but it was not easy. And now Turkey's rival is gone, Iran's main ally is gone, and it's a new system in Syria that is, if not fully aligned and supported by Turkey, at least much more sympathetic than before. So for Turkey, this is still not an easy southern neighbor, but overall, it does come out as one of the, if not the main winner.
In a year of a lot of upheaval in the Middle East and a lot of surprises, I think one of the things that surprised me the most was the Israeli strike in Doha, in Hamas leadership in the heart of Qatar. I was wondering if you could explain to our listeners and to us what happened, why it happened, and what the fallout of that's going to be, particularly in the context of U.S.-Qatari relationships as well.
So if I can take just a few seconds before that to say something about the role of Qatar in the peace process, Israel, Palestine, and the region in general. So there's been a lot of accusations, in some cases disinformation, about Qatar's role. Qatar does not support Hamas. That is not true. Qatar, and I'm going to simplify 15 years of history, but Qatar was asked by the US and Israel to host a Hamas political office in Doha, Qatar's capital, a few years ago, and to offer its services as a mediator. This was done at Israel and the US's request. Of course, it was consistent with what Qatar was already doing, but if the US and Israel had not wanted this, Qatar would not have done it, at least not to this extent. Qatar was also sending assistance to Gaza, was paying civil service salaries at Netanyahu's request. Right?
Yeah, I just want to take a second and really emphasize that, because this is a fight that I constantly get in with people. The narrative is very much Qatar is funding Hamas.
No, not.
Yeah, technically, yes.
I mean,
in the sense of funding the civil service salaries and all of those kinds of things.
But
exactly at the behest of Israel and the United States. So it's very different than surreptitiously financing a terrorist group to conduct attacks.
That's absolutely no. That's an important nuance, and that's what Iran does. I mean, the arming and financing of Hamas on the terrorist side, that's what Iran does. Period. That's to say what Qatar's role is. So when Israel launched an attack on Qatar in September, a few weeks ago, it was a shock to the Qataris, because it's breaking the commitment that you want Qatar to play that role of mediator, which, again, Israel has always wanted. Trump has wanted. Trump was very clear about that at previous American administrations. So you bomb the mediator. So it's an absolute breaking of the agreed-to status of Qatar as a mediator. The other thing I would say from the American perspective, how much of a bad idea this was, and that's why Americans, not just Trump, were really furious at this, is the reaction that it triggered in other Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as well as Qatar. Yes, these countries are different. Yes, they have their own, internal fault lines within the Gulf. But these are countries that are very close to the U.S., that very much value their relation with the U.S. and vice versa. And they, again, simplifying, went to the U.S. and say, how can you let this happen? And this had the potential to be a major, major breaking point in U.S. Gulf relations, which is why the U.S. very quickly went into damage control mode. To me, was the best illustration of how unhappy the U.S. was Trump forcing Netanyahu to call Qatar and apologize from the White House with cameras looking. I mean, that was an absolute humiliation of Netanyahu, which only could happen because the U.S. was deeply unhappy with the decision to do that. And then after that, you saw the U.S. reaffirming in extremely public and open ways the importance of the relationship with Qatar and with the Gulf in general. By everything I've just said, it was an incredibly bad move by Israel at every level in terms of the peace process or eventual peace process in Gaza and in terms of U.S. Gulf relations. That being said, there is a counter argument to say, okay, all true, but it's really one of the key events that triggered Trump to intensify his push for a ceasefire. Kind of a twisted logic, not satisfying as a logic, but not entirely inaccurate. Is it to say that if it had not happened, there would have been no ceasefire in Gaza now? Probably not, but who knows? But it did contribute to Trump's decision to really ramp up efforts to get a ceasefire.
So ultimately it backfired for Netanyahu.
Absolutely.
And I can't help but also note that Qatar gave Trump a plane. Apparently, I think that the Trump administration is allowing Qatar to now have a military presence. I mean, they were saying there was a press release about some kind of military base, and then there was pushback saying, no, they're just going to be here. I mean, this relationship really does seem to have accelerated in a lot of areas, right? I mean, both personal, military, and political.
I mean, the U.S.-Qatar relationship has been intensifying for years. It was already very close, and that's continued under Trump. I mean, the largest American base in the Middle East is in Qatar. A lot of American installations, especially for the Air Force, are in Qatar. The Navy is a bit more in Bahrain, right next door. It's extremely beneficial for the U.S., and the U.S. really values that. And there were a few interrogations, just after Harris lost and Biden and Trump was on his way to power in the early days of Trump. Is he going to maintain that relationship? It was very clear early on that the answer is yes. On the specific two issues that you mentioned, the military facility, not a base, in the U.S., in Idaho, if I remember correctly, it is something that is fairly common in the sense that American allies or partners that benefit from American training will have access to facilities on American bases where their soldiers can live in residences and so on, especially if you don't want them, for a variety of reasons, to live outside the base in small towns in Idaho. A bunch of Qatari military officers, not sure.
I was just going to wonder, like, the transition from Qatar to Idaho is going to be substantial.
In terms, if you remove the politics of the U.S.-Qatar relationship, it's actually a very standard thing of a country that is a close partner or ally of the U.S. having its own facilities where its officers can go and get training from the American Air Force or American, whichever branch of the American military. That's fairly standard. Was there an intensification after September to signal from the Trump administration that the relationship is close? Probably. Even if I don't know that for a fact, I assume that it's probably the case.
And I think the establishment of that facility in Idaho is also related to the purchase of aircraft from the U.S. military and the training that Thomas was alluding to,
exactly.
too. But yeah, the gold-plated plane predates all of this.
I mean, the issue of the $400 million plane that Qatar is allegedly giving to Trump, and so many details of this are not clear that I'm not even sure what exactly is going on. First of all, it's a ridiculously bad idea, and it's tremendously corrupt on Trump's part. I mean, to me, that's the one thing that really matters. Qatar, I mean, not to say that it doesn't matter, but Qatar is a dictatorship that regularly buys off allies, partners. It's a tremendously corrupt system. So not to say that it's okay, but it's consistent with a pattern that we've seen on the Qatari side. It's not consistent with a pattern that we should see on the American side. So to me, that's where the difference is. Among the many questions that I have is, this is a plane that was used for luxury purposes for rich people. Air Force One is meant to be an extraordinarily secure flying skiff in many ways. So how do you secure that plane? It's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's going to take years. I struggle to see in what scenario that plane could be usable as an Air Force One by the end of Trump's mandate. I really struggle to see that, even if I can't say that for sure because we don't know the details. So is this just a way for Qatar, in its usually corrupt way, to buy off an unusually corrupt American president? And who cares from Qatar's perspective whether the plane actually flies as Air Force One or not? That there could be something to that.
You are a Yemen expert. I don't know how many Yemen experts there are in the world, but you are one of them. I mean, Yemen was the center of the Signal Gate fiasco. Since Signal Gate, which we'll remember is the signal discussion about targeting Houthis in Yemen, what's been going on?
Things haven't really changed. And, the US was striking Yemen more than 1,000 strikes by some count between April and June, March and May, in the spring anyways, of this year, with very limited impact. Basically, what's going on in Yemen is that the Houthis have de facto won the civil war in the country. The Houthis control the capital, Sana'a. They control about a third of the country's territory, but with about 2/3 of the population. They are supported by Iran, that has been essential in allowing them to gain so much power inside Yemen. But Iran's support is only half the story. The other half of the story to explain the Houthis' success is the incompetence and weakness of their adversaries. There is something called the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which was kicked out of the capital by the Houthis 11 years ago now in 2014. The internationally recognized government, which has the seat at the UN, which is recognized by every country in the world except Iran, is extremely fragmented. It is weak. It is corrupt. And it's frankly incompetent. And that's been the biggest gift to the Houthis. It is divided between Aden in the south of Yemen, but also Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi and Dubai in the UAE. It is viewed as illegitimate by a large number of Yemenis, including opponents of the Houthis. And that's been the key part of the story. So from the American perspective, to bomb the Houthis, they have done intermittently since going back to Biden in January 2024, is not necessarily a bad idea. But if it's purely bombing for the sake of bombing with absolutely no political strategy, which is something we've seen a lot with the US over the years, to actually create a counterweight to the Houthis that can compete with them, then it's completely pointless. And if anything, it's counterproductive. So a lot of Yemen watchers, we've been banging our heads constantly by saying, well, yes, you want to weaken the Houthis. Military strikes, and I don't necessarily oppose the idea of strikes against the Houthis, financial sanctions, which are ramping up against the Houthis, and other measures to try to contain them, are necessary because the Houthis are really, really nasty. That cannot be underestimated enough. But as long as there's no coherent strategy to build up an opposition to the Houthis by the US, but also by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the Houthis are going to laugh their way to the bank, quite literally, and that's been the case so far.
Are they still interrupting shipping?
Since the ceasefire in Gaza, the Houthis have significantly slowed down, almost stopped, not completely, but almost stopped attacks on Red Sea shipping. But there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that it is only a temporary suspension of attacks on Red Sea shipping. It will start again at some point. Could it be next week, next month? I have no idea. But the Houthis have been very clear when you pay attention to what they do, that they will continue attacking Red Sea shipping, either to protest against Israel. And since we have a very fragile ceasefire, we don't have peace in Gaza, right? It's a threat they will use again, but it's a threat they will use against Saudi Arabia. It's a threat they will use against the US or against anybody else. And basically the bottom line is that threats on Red Sea shipping are with us to stay for the long term.
So, Thomas, in your answer there, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, which actually hasn't come up a lot in our discussion really today, interestingly enough, given that, US-Saudi relations seem to often be a center point of thinking about politics in the Middle East. Mark Carney seems to have extended an open hand to Mohammed bin Salman when he invited him to the G7 earlier this year. And of course, MBS could make it. He said he was busy with everything that was going on. But still, that was pretty remarkable given how poor relations between Canada and Saudi Arabia have been, particularly with the Trudeau government. And on top of this, more recently, we have heard that there may be a pact between the United States and Saudi Arabia, some kind of military pact, which to me seemed to be kind of something that had caused a lot of anger previously in the Middle East in the 80s and 90s, but everything goes around, comes around, I guess. So what are your takes on what's happening now with Saudi Arabia, maybe with Canada and the United States?
So a few points on Canada Saudi and then a few points on US Saudi. So as we remember, in 2018, there's a dispute between Canada and Saudi Arabia. Ambassadors are called back, threats from the Saudi side, relations take a very chilly turn, and so on. Canada actually reconciled with Saudi Arabia a year and a half ago, and we exchanged ambassadors last year. There's a Saudi ambassador here in Canada. We have an ambassador over there in Saudi Arabia. And relations have been quite cordial. And there's been a very clear, publicly expressed interest on both sides to patch up, put the past behind, and rebuild relations. That being said, there's always a difference between tone and substance. Despite the genuinely warm tone, which was not hypocritical, I think it was sincere on both sides, there's the reality of bandwidth, which is that for both sides, the other is not a priority. So despite the tone, you didn't see relations, ramp back up at an exponential scale. But I do think that there's every reason to expect that in the coming years that we will continue to see, as a result of that genuine willingness on both sides to re-engage, closer and closer relations. And I think that even though I haven't seen a lot on the part of the Carney government on the Gulf, if you think about the very clear intent to diversify trade and security relations beyond the US, to the Indo-Pacific, to Europe, the Gulf to me has to factor in somewhere, even if it will never be a priority, given that there's just limited bandwidth. So that I think is on the Canadian side. In terms of the invitation to the G7, I think that was a smart move by Carney. I am absolutely not surprised that Mohammed bin Salman declined. He doesn't travel a lot, so it's not surprising that he said no. But at least just the fact of the invitation was a positive
Why?
signal on Canada's side.
Yeah, good question. Why doesn't he travel a lot? Is he worried about leaving? Is he?
In earlier years, it was out of paranoia for the situation inside Saudi Arabia. Not anymore. His position is absolutely secure in Saudi Arabia now. There's no challenge to his rule. I mean, challengers to his rule are in exile, dead, or in prison. So he's absolutely secure now in a way that he was not in his earlier years. I think it's more an issue of focusing on Saudi Arabia, focusing on the regional context. He does travel to the US every now and then, but he fundamentally mostly stays in Saudi Arabia. On the US Saudi Arabia side, there was a lot of talk before October 2023 and the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel that there was the possibility of some kind of trilateral pact between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the US, where there would be a defense pact between Saudi Arabia and the US, which would have included some kind of security guarantee by the US, recognition of a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So basically an extension of the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia. I am skeptical when people say that that was very close in October 2023. I think there was absolutely discussions, but I'm not sure that it was that close to happen because many reasons, but one of them that Mohammed bin Salman was reluctant to agree to that in the absence of either an actual Palestinian state or at least serious progress towards a Palestinian state. That was never fully clear, but we certainly were nowhere near any kind of progress on the Palestinian state before October 2023. So I think Mohammed bin Salman was interested in these talks to see what concessions he could extract from the US, but full normalization with Israel, I'm skeptical that it was likely to happen back then. Today, you said that we don't hear a lot about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is in a bit of an awkward position because it is absolutely not unhappy to see Hamas getting whacked and to see Hezbollah and Iran and other Iran non-state actors getting whacked. But at the same time, pro-Palestinian feelings are very strong among the population in Saudi Arabia, as they are throughout the Middle East and the Muslim world. So for Saudi Arabia and any other Arab government, especially non-democratic Arab governments, there's a bit of an awkward balance to keep here of cheering on Israel, but not wanting to be seen publicly doing that, right? And publicly even criticizing Israel, and in some cases in very strong terms by Saudi Arabia. So it's that awkward balance that ultimately often manifests itself in silence or in keeping a low profile.
One of the things we didn't hear a lot about was US or Canadian reaction to Saudi's new defense pact with Pakistan. I was surprised, given my perception of the closeness between bin Salman and Trump, for the need to go to Pakistan for a defense agreement. And yet I understand that it is, off books, but I haven't really heard Canada's response or understanding to that, or the general Western consensus about our opinion on that defense pact.
I mean, Canada's position on like Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact. I mean, I don't think Saudi and Pakistan really one what Canada is saying about this. I mean, I think that there's not much to make of that Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact, basically. First of all, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have been very close for years. There have been rumors for decades of some kind of a nuclear agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, that if, for example, Iran gets a nuclear bomb, or perhaps in other circumstances, Pakistan would transfer some nuclear technology, if not a full nuclear bomb, to Saudi Arabia. What is true in that, we don't know, but there's been rumors about that forever. And beyond those rumors, strictly on the nuclear side, there's been reasonably close military cooperation between the two for a long time. So that's not new. To me, that defense pact was a gesture of public discontent with the strike on Qatar, and it was meant as a signal to the Israeli strike on Qatar, and it was meant as a signal to Washington, take us seriously, because this is not good. But if you actually look at did that Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact make a substantial change in the Saudi-Pakistan defense relationship? I see no proof that it does. And, I see a public expression of discontent. I see pressure on the U.S., but I don't see this is not a sea change, to be blunt, between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia.
That's really great, Thomas. So I want to ask if there are any other actors or issues that we should be paying attention to. And then finally, if you could maybe reflect on all of this and implications for Canada.
Other actors that we should reflect on, I mean, there could be a long list, but one actor that, if I'm not mistaken, we did not mention a single time is China. I may be wrong, but I don't think we said the word China since the beginning. And that's probably not a coincidence, in the sense that China's role in the Middle East is really interesting in many ways. China is now the number one trade partner for most states in the region, including closest American partners. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their number one trade partner is China. It's not the US. And that's been increasing significantly year on year, and that's probably going to continue increasing. But what's been really interesting, if not contradictory, in China's approach to the Middle East is that the rise in trade interests has not been followed by a rise in political security military interest. China has worked very hard to keep a major gap between its rising trade presence and its not rising security and military presence in the Middle East. I've always wondered how sustainable that gap is in the very long term. If you go to 2030, 2040, 2050, can you stay so commercially invested in a region where American military and security influence is so dominant? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I'm not trying to predict one way or the other, but there is a tension there. So that's why when we're talking about everything that we've been talking on now, Israeli strikes on Qatar, Israel, Iran, US, Iran, Saudi, Pakistan, like everything we've talked about, Yemen for the last while, China doesn't come up because we didn't talk about trade. We talked about security and military developments, where China has very actively and I would use the word artificially, ensured that it is not a major player. So to me, that is one of the key trends still to continue watching. And the second half of your question was on implications for Canada. I think there's a number of implications to make on Israel-Palestine and on Israel-Gaza. What I would say is that unoriginally, Canada has absolutely no influence on this conflict. And I just roll my eyes to the back of my head whenever I hear people in Canada saying Canada should play a leadership role in trying to broker. No, we won't. Nobody in the region is asking us to play any kind of role, let alone a leadership role, in mediating something between Israel and Hamas. Like, no one is asking. No one is coming to knock at our door. Does that mean that we have nothing to say, nothing to do? No, I think we do have a number of interests, but if Canada is to have a useful role, and I say useful in a very circumscribed way, not in a leadership way, because that's not going to happen. In a circumscribed way, we can have a useful role if we coordinate closely with allies. And this is a question when I go to conferences in Bahrain or Qatar or elsewhere, and I ask the question to Gulf officials, what can mid-sized countries do? American allies, assuming we're kind of still an American ally, what can we do? The answer that always comes up is unity of action. If you ask Bahrainis or Qataris or Saudis or Emiratis, does Canada matter? The answer is no. But if you ask them, do Europeans, Canada, and Australians acting together, do they matter? The answer is yes. So for me, the way for Canada to play some kind of a role is in coordination with allies. If that means the US, good. If it doesn't mean the US because we disagree on too much stuff and we want to get closer to the Europeans, good. But that's the way we can have a role.
Would it be in Canadian interests to play a role in the provision of humanitarian aid or the distribution of aid during rebuilding and all that kind of stuff? Or is that is there no real benefit to Canadian interest in that sense?
No, I think if you go down in the details and the list of things that we can do along with allies and partners to try to play a role in what comes next in Gaza, humanitarian assistance is one. I would also add, though, beyond humanitarian assistance, development assistance, because of course you want to feed and provide medicine to people who are hungry and dying, but there needs to be long-term rebuilding, right? To rebuild the economy, infrastructure, and so on. On the security side, Canada can play a role. We have been a useful contributor to the longstanding American-led mission called the United States Security Coordinator, USSC, to train Palestinian security forces. If things go reasonably not too bad in the coming months and years in Gaza, and there is an effort to build a new kind of Palestinian security force in Gaza, with obviously every single detail yet to be negotiated, there will be a role for a country like us, and we're good at this, to train future Palestinian forces in Gaza on the security side, on the police side, on the border security side, on the intelligence side. So yes, these are things we can do, but of course not on our own. And if I could make one other point on Jessica's question on Canadian interests and what this means for Canada, I would come back to the point about the Gulf. Right now, as everybody says, Canada needs to diversify its trade and security partnerships beyond the US. This is existential for us. And yes, I think that goes primarily through Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Absolutely. These are the two regions that come far before the Middle East. But I do think somewhere in the list, after Europe and the Indo-Pacific, there is the Gulf. And we have really neglected the Gulf since the Harper years. The last time that a Canadian government was serious about building bridges in the Gulf, and by the Gulf, I mean the rich petromonarchies, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, in particular, Bahrain, was in the Harper majority government of 2011 to 15. The Trudeau government, even before the dispute with Saudi Arabia in 2018, was very distant with the Gulf and uninterested. And I think that has set us back in terms of our relations with these countries. I am not aware of significant public pronouncements by the new Carney government on their views on the Gulf. But my suggestion would be that as part of our broader efforts to diversify, especially on the trade side, there is some potential there, keeping in mind that our bandwidth of diversification will be primarily occupied by Europe and the Indo-Pacific, but I would hope that there's a little space left for the Gulf.
So, Thomas, on that note, I want to thank you. We have almost certainly talked as much as we can in under an hour. And it's just so impressive, your breadth of knowledge of the Middle East and kind of thorough analysis of what the implications for Canada actually are. So thanks for being our first repeat guest. We hope to have you on a couple times more in the future. Certainly as exactly. Repeat,
Next time
exactly.
we'll have guest swag.
I love this. I love this for us. We'll set up the merch biz. It's going to be great. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for you listeners, if you have the time, we would really appreciate it if you could rate and review the podcast. I did notice we have about 3 reviews. Let's see if we can get that up to 10, maybe in the next little while. Thanks once again for listening.